Reading with your kids.
Hey, so great to see you. Come on in. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We hope you subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. We are publishing this episode on the first night of Hanukkah, and we are celebrating with author Sheryl Haft. She is celebrating her beautiful book, Good Night Bubbala, a beautiful and hilarious parody of the children's classic Good Night Moon. Since this is the first night of Hanukkah, that means that New Year's Eve is right around the corner. And I will be celebrating New Year's Eve in the beautiful city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. That's right, Jedley's Totally Interactive Magic Circus will be celebrating New Year's Eve in the beautiful city of New Bedford. And specifically, we'll be celebrating in the New Bedford Public Library. We're going to be presenting two shows, and there's a whole lot of celebrating going on in New Bedford that evening. You can check it out. NewBedfordGuide.com has a list of all of the events that are available. Everything is free and open to the public. We would love to meet you. That's New Year's Eve in the beautiful city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Joining us on the line right now from New York City. I'm so excited. This author, talk about a fun book. We're talking today to the author of Good Night Bubbala, Sheryl Haft. Sheryl, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome.
Oh, Jed, it's an honor. Thank you for having me.
I just love this. If you're not familiar with Good Night Bubbala, you are familiar with is it fair to say the inspiration for Good Night Bubbala?
Absolutely. That's Good Night Moon.
Good Night Moon. That's right. And that is such a classic children's story. I know I've read it here in my home to my kids. But Good Night Bubbala is a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, Good Night Moon was published in 1947. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, it's a beautiful, comforting book. But I couldn't help but wonder when I was reading it recently what that story might look like now, mm-hmm. and particularly what it might look like with my family, my big, noisy, Jewish, not so quiet family.
It's interesting you're talking about your big, not so quiet Jewish family, and I grew up in a not really big. Well, it was big in that we had all our cousins living right around the same neighborhood. And it was an Irish family, and it was not at all quiet. And my wife grew up in a Puerto Rican family, which is absolutely not quiet. So I'm wondering where all these quiet families were, because I certainly never ran into any of them.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I've shared this book with many friends who are not familiar with Jewish heritage. And like you, they often say, this is my grandma, this is my crazy family. And I really feel like the book has a lot of universal values. The idea of gathering with loved ones, cherishing your elders, sharing favorite food and music. So I'm so happy. I do hope that, kids and families of any culture could relate to this book.
Absolutely. Now, Bubbala is the Jewish word for grandmother. Am I right?
So like mamacita in Spanish, which means little mommy, Bubbala actually means little grandma. Okay. So a bubby is a grandma.
Okay.
And a bubbala in its exact translation is little grandma. But it's really meant as a term of endearment. It means my little darling. It usually comes with a pinch of the cheek. My little sweetheart.
Well, I think this is, I really love this for a lot of reasons. Number one, I was telling Sheryl beforehand, and I've shared this on the podcast in the past. We get dozens and dozens of books here at the studio, unsolicited, and it's a real blessing because we're able to share them with shelters that serve homeless families. But the first person who gets a crack at those books is my wife. And this book came in, and the color and the art just caught her eye, and she's like, I love Good Night Moon. I have to get this. And so that at Good Night Bubbala is in her classroom now.
Well, first of all, Jill Weber did such a beautiful job bringing the book to life. She brought charm and warmth. We had some cool conversations about how to make the rabbits sort of reflect current culture. For example, the 4 grandparents in the book, we learned that grandparents don't like being depicted as old. So 2 of the grandparents are kind of hip. One has a goatee, one has kind of a cool outfit. So she did such a great job of making the book beautiful. But I also feel like the glossary in the back will help teachers learn how to pronounce the words. Yiddish is just such a vibrant language. It's a funny, expressive language. And I have had people say that flipping back to the glossary is helpful to learn how to pronounce the words and also how to, what the meanings are.
That's awesome. Now, I grew up in an area of Boston where we had a lot of Jewish neighbors. So, and I worked, one of my first jobs in high school was working in a kosher deli. And so a lot of those words are very familiar. And
a shmear on the bagel.
Shmear and hey, and some other words that I probably can't say.
Yeah.
But, so these words are very familiar to me, but I absolutely understand that they may be, that, a lot of folks may not be familiar with oive and mensch and, mitzvah.
Yeah. I tried to pick words that I don't speak Yiddish either. I heard it from my grandma, and of course, like you, I heard it around the city. But there were always these words that I thought were so funny and feisty. So I picked those words that were, I think, most familiar. But you can go through The Joys of Yiddish by Leo Rostin, and there's so many of those words are words that you wouldn't put into a kid's book.
One of the reasons why I love this book is kind of what you were talking about earlier. It's obviously for a Jewish family, this would be just ideal and so much fun for them. But I think it's also really, really fun for every family to get to know other families and to see the differences and to learn the different words and to understand that, that different cultures have different foods and different traditions and different toys. And so that's awesome to learn about. But I also think it's wonderful that when we're looking at a book like Good Night Bubbala, that as we said earlier, it's like, yeah, that happens in our family. And yeah, and so-and-so is an Italian family and it happens in their family too.
Yeah, I had mentioned that my niece is a early education teacher, and she thought it was really important to have activities that teachers and parents could use both when reading this book and then also, when the book is closed. So when reading the book, there's a really fun I Spy game, which gives kids a chance to, find something that's red, to find the mouse, which was like a kind of a fun little game that was always a part of Good Night Moon. And Good Night Bubbala also has a mouse hiding in most of the spreads. But for after the book, there's a my mishpacha, which means my whole family. There's a journal that kids can, draw and fill out, and it asks them, what does your family do for fun? What favorite foods does your family like? And I think kids will find that, there are so many similarities and then also so many things that make their families unique.
Absolutely. And again, it's just such a wonderful celebration of family and love and fun. And I think that's something that we don't have enough of in this world.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the book is called Good Night Bubbala, a joyful parody. Because I did feel like, for me, I had moved far from my family, and as my kids have gotten older, we have become scattered all across the country. And so I think part of this book was this wish that many people have to have your family gathered around you. And I thought that this little bunny going to bed, instead of going to sleep just with one quiet old lady whispering hush, I love this fantasy of having a surprise pajama party with all his loved ones, all his family gathered around him. And I do think that is that's a joyful idea that, you know, in our busy lives, we don't all get to do all that much.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that worries me is that I see a lot, you know, I mentioned earlier that some of the books that come into the studio, we share with a shelter that serves homeless moms, young teenage moms who are homeless. And it worries me because, you know, as, you know, we talked about, you know, I grew up in this loud Irish family. My wife grew up in a loud Puerto Rican family. You grew up in a loud Jewish family. There are a lot of kids growing up, and they might be loud and chaotic, but it's not family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they don't have the support that you and I had, and that my wife had, and that so many people have. And that concerns me.
I know what you're saying, and I do think that that's the beauty of books. Mm-hmm. I think we often read books because we want to sort of dream about things that we are wishing for, and also have experiences that we may not be able to have. Similar to how I'd love to read about, you know, an astronaut that gets to go to the moon. Mm-hmm. You know, I won't get to do that myself, but there's a beauty in being able to have that experience in a children's book. And I think that's part of what this book offers, is just like sort of a fun adventure, you know, before you go to sleep at night. I mean, that said, the bunny, like in Good Night Moon, you know, goes to sleep by himself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for kids too, is to learn to, you know, feel comforted by cuddling up into bed and, you know, saying goodnight to their toys and the things that they're lucky to have.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, you dream about going to the moon, but that you'll never have that chance. This has been an adventure for you. You've had quite an adventurous life. You haven't always been a children's author.
No, I actually, I've always been a design person. I actually worked for Warner Brothers, and I did work on their children's publishing, creating books based on their characters like Bugs Bunny and Batman. Mm-hmm. So, my interest in children's books started early on. It was when I was raising my children that I started to write stories, the same way that some people write poetry. I just always loved writing stories, and, you know, it took me quite a long time to get my first book published. It's certainly been a labor of love.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Bugs Bunny. Talk about I loved Bugs Bunny, and I grew up, it was, Bugs Bunny was just this classic thing that I loved for so long, because I loved it for one reason when I was a kid. And then when I became a teenager, it was funny for completely different reasons. And then when my kids started watching it and I was a lot older, I was like, well, this is still funny, and there's still new stuff that I'm discovering.
Right? I mean, there are big risk takers in that cartoon. It's funny, you know, I haven't mentioned this to anybody, but when we were conceiving of the end of the book, it ends quietly. You know, good night kisses, good night stars above, good night Bubbala, my mensch, my love. And then if you turn the page, there's this little kind of addendum, and the inspiration for that was the little "that's all, folks," you know, that comes at the end of the Looney Tune. So after good night Bubbala, my mensch, my love, you turn the page and it says, and good night gorilla. That's the whole Megillah. Which means that's the whole story. That was that little, you know, that's all, folks, that came at the end of the cartoon. That was the inspiration for that.
Yeah. You know, now that you mention that, I think the other place that I heard a lot of Yiddish as I was growing up is in all those old cartoons and media that came out of the 30s and the 40s.
Really? I'd love to find some of those.
Yeah. Well, you know, there was Megillah Gorilla. and,
yeah.
You know, a lot of the stuff that Mel Brooks conceived of and created, mm-hmm. and just. So it's funny. I feel like I'm on this nostalgia trip, and you know, I'm remembering all these wonderful, wonderful books and cartoons and movies that were part of my life growing up. How does it feel for you knowing that there's going to be a generation of kids, maybe multiple generations of kids, who are going to be growing up with Good Night Bubbala, and they're going to be, you know, in a few decades, they're going to be looking back and remembering that?
Jed, I mean, that makes me cry because I just think that, like, our country is an interesting dynamic place because of all of the different cultures and immigrants that we have. I feel that the English language is dynamic because of all the influences we've had. And I don't think Yiddish plays a big role in the English language, but I think it really helps make it interesting and fun. And some of the words that we hear that we don't even realize are Yiddish, like schlep and, don't kvetch and, I want to shmear on my bagel. I just think that that makes the language all the more, richer. I do feel like some of the language is being lost. I mean, my kids don't know very much Yiddish, and I certainly know a lot less than my parents and grandparents. And so I've heard so many millennials and young parents say that they're really happy to have Good Night Bubbala as a way to teach their kids some of this language in a fun and accessible way.
Yeah, and as you were speaking about that and talking about the Yiddish words that are so much a part of our American culture, certainly in places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and probably Miami, you hear people say, well, English, English is the official language of America, and it isn't. I mean, English might be the kind of the backbone, but we use Yiddish words, we use Spanish words, there are French words, there are all these other words that are so much part of our vocabulary here in the United States, and I think that's one of the reasons this country is so great.
Well, yes. I mean, look, if you think about going out to dinner, taking your family out, it's so fun that you can decide between going for Mexican food or Japanese food or, Italian food. So I really hope that Yiddish stays alive because it's a feisty, fun, and expressive language. And there are actually Yiddish words that just don't really have an equivalent. To see your child graduate, makes you kvel, which means beaming with pride and pleasure. And the word kvel just has an emotion to it that, I think is very special.
Yeah. And that whole idea of a mitzvah, I love that when, I hope I'm using it right, when someone does a mitzvah for you.
Yes. No, I mean, I think that for every family, we want to impart to our children and we want to have in ourselves, this idea that we're always not just thinking of ourselves, but we're also thinking of others. And mitzvahs are very much about doing for others. Just even knowing how to, welcome guests, how to think about somebody who's sick, cherishing our elders. And then in the book, there's a tzedakah box, which is a little bit like a UNICEF box. And it's a tradition for Jewish families to collect money to give to people who need it. So, and that's also a mitzvah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you celebrate the different generations in Good Night Bubbala because again, and that's another thing that I think some folks are losing, when I travel to different countries, I see it's very natural to see at an event, at a concert or other kind of event, young kids and grandparents and teenagers and middle-aged people and young adults all kind of being together and celebrating together. I don't see that as much here in the States, and I think that's something that we need to really hold on to, and I'm glad that that's so present in Good Night Bubbala.
Thank you for noticing that. Some of the reviews on Amazon have made me cry, and it's to that effect. I think that this is a good opportunity for grandparents to share this book with grandchildren. It's very much about handing down traditions and the language. And so I think the book itself actually gives an opportunity for generations to come together.
Yeah. And just between you and I, some grandparents have to get over it. I mean, we are old, okay? We should celebrate the fact that we made it this long. Well, I know that Good Night Bubbala isn't your first book. Tell us just a little bit about the other books that are available from Sheryl Haft.
Well, all of my books are about inspiring kids' imagination. My first book is a little bit like Harold and the Purple Crayon. It's called I Love You, Blanky. And it's about a child who, with his blankie, imagines sailing the seas, flying to the moon, and then parachuting down into bed. It's only 83 words, but it's become a favorite for many people. My other book is Baby Boo, I Love You. And that's about a child who is sort of playing a parent role to a little doll. And it's a book about, being loving to others. It's a very sweet book, also in verse. And the book that I've been working on, which is expected out in 2021, is related to the work that I do with Kids Engineer. I have an after-school program that teaches kids invention building and basic design principles. And that book is Maisie's Amazing Machines, and that's due out in 2021.
Excellent. Well, I am really excited about that. I don't want to have to wait until 2021 to have you back on, but you certainly are welcome to come back and celebrate that new book.
Well, we want your wife involved with that one because that one will definitely have lots of teacher materials.
That's awesome. Now, are there places online where folks can connect with Sheryl Haft and sign up for a newsletter to make sure that they know exactly when the new books are coming out?
Absolutely. If they go to SherylHaft.com, there's an opportunity under Connect to sign up for my newsletter. There's a games and activities tab so they can download some of the activities I've discussed. There's also 2 wonderful songs that I've had written for this book. I've had songs written for every book. One is called Good Night Bubbala, the song, and that follows the text. It's got some dancing music. And then there's another song called We're Gonna Learn Some Yiddish, written by Rebecca Schofer from the 92nd Street Y. And that helps orient kids towards some of the Yiddish words. And then, of course, we can't forget the latke recipe at the back of the book, created by my dear, wonderful friend, Ina Garten.
Excellent. I love it. I have to check out We're Gonna Learn Some Yiddish. That's so...
good. Shmear the cream cheese this way. Shmear the cream cheese that way.
That is wonderful. And this has been so much fun. I'm going to check out the recipe. I'm going to check out the teacher resources for my wife, and maybe I can get in there and share them with the kids. She has a great group of kids this year. And I've had such a great time speaking to you.
Oh, Jed, you asked such wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
We've been speaking to the author of the brand new book, Good Night Bubbala. It is a fantastic book by our guest, Sheryl Haft. Sheryl, thanks so much for being part of the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Jed.
Be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be coming to us from Hong Kong. She is Michelle Sun, and she'll be telling us about her wonderful book, First Time Coders. That's the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. If you are the author of a fantastic children's book, whether it is a parody of a classic children's book or a nonfiction book talking about coding or STEM subjects, or just a fun book that will spawn in your imagination, we would love to have you as a guest on the show. Being a guest, it's fun, it's easy, and it gives you the chance to tell thousands and thousands of people about your fantastic children's book. And this is something that we haven't spoken about in the past. When you become a guest on the show, the episode that you appear on, that episode is available as long as we're publishing. That's right, we're approaching the 3rd anniversary of the show. We've produced over 650 episodes of the podcast, and all of those are still available on our website, readingwithyourkids.com, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and every guest that comes on the show receives a link, and that link can be copy and pasted into your social media, on to your website, and it lives there forever. What a valuable tool to help people know about you and know about your great book. Like I said, it's fun, it's easy, and it doesn't cost you a thing. All you need to do is go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, click on the contact button at the bottom of the page. Let us know about your great book. We'll let you know the next easy steps. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so very wonderful. Of course, we want to thank Sheryl Haft. Celebrate Hanukkah, celebrate family with her beautiful and fun book, Good Night Bubbala. I also want to thank the people of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Come on down New Year's Eve, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and experience Jedley's Totally Interactive Magic Circus. I want to thank my amazing producer, Fatima Khan, for all she does for the show. Don't miss her blog at readingwithyourkids.com. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all of the support she gives me. I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.